One of the issues with social media is two-dimensional. Human beings are designed for three-dimensional interaction, to be in each other's three-dimensional space with each other, so you can feel, sense, reflect three-dimensionally. When we remove that and just have two dimensions, it makes it a lot easier to be judgmental or to be glib or just to make a presumption about someone because you're not actually in that space with them.
Hi, I'm Angelique Letizia, a writer, director, and creator of the Call Cut Method. It's a tool to shift your frequency, rewrite your inner script, and realign you with the energy of your highest potential. This podcast is your behind-the-scenes pass to alchemizing that energy. So if you're ready to interrupt the script, reclaim your power, and write your story that you were actually born to live, you're in the right place. Today's guest is Dr. Ashok Bhattacharya, a psychiatrist who has spent nearly 40 years guiding people through their deepest struggles. He's the founder of the Empathy Clinic, where healing begins with compassion and the power of story. By integrating empathy, he helps individuals and couples find balance and brings hopes to those living with post-traumatic stress disorder. His work reminds us that true healing begins when we are seen, heard, and understood. I have been waiting for this conversation. Thank you for being on Call Cut with Angelique.
Thank you so much, Angelique, for inviting me. I look forward to what's going to happen next.
Yes. So before we get started, you have been doing a lot in the empathy, compassion sort of realms, especially where it comes to storytelling. And that's why I find you so interesting and your story so interesting, because we talk a lot about story and what story is and how it affects us, how it affects our lives, how it affects our reality. But what's interesting about what you do is you actually focus that story around empathy and compassion. I would love for you to talk a little bit to our audience about how you do that and how you got started.
Well, I suppose I got started when my mummy was telling me stories as a child. One of the ways that we teach children is to tell them stories. In fact, one of the main ways that we learn anything is by receiving, interpreting, and reflecting in our mind a story. And if a story starts just with words, the next thing we have to do is manufacture those images in our mind that the words can create for us. And when I think about that, a story is just words that become images. And then if we're making movies, then we can actually produce that image for other people to see it. Always a challenge, of course, for directors. Then empathy is a very similar process where someone's telling us something, we're imagining their story in our mind, hopefully from their perspective, not ours. And that way we can reflect back to them. So is this what you experienced when that happened to you? Is this how you felt when what happened to you? And if you've been listening, the most important organ of empathy is the ear. If you've been listening and watching and sensing and feeling and reflect that back, that's when a story comes to life for that person. The problem happens, however, that stories are somewhat malleable. And that means that when a story goes into our ears and into our minds and into our soul and into our heart, our sensibilities kind of edit the story over time. And that's why if we go to Newfoundland and I pick a rock up off the beach and it's smooth, you're saying it's smooth, saying it started off as a jagged rock. But time and the waves have rolled that rock on the ocean of life for so many years, it has become smooth. And the same thing happens with stories. So when we're explaining a story to someone, especially someone said, well, this happened to me years and years ago, that's the jagged rock. And when they're describing it to you now, it might be smooth. So that's why it's really important not just to look at the story per se, but to imagine the evolution of that story over time, and I'll leave it there.
Oh, no, that's really interesting, because that goes into the idea that our traumas and our dramas actually create the original story, the jagged edge that you were just referring to. And that is the piece that is so difficult in my experience, personally, and then also in working with people, because those traumas, dramas, bloodline entanglements, and all of these stories that some of them we created, but some were created for us in our ancestry they're very deep in our psyche. And this idea that we have to do that shadow work
to unlock those stories can be daunting for some people.
Well, I would say it's daunting for everybody because whenever we go into a story that has pain or trauma or strong emotions or loss and grief, we remember the story a little differently as we move forward. And the other thing the brain does is the brain tries to protect us from pain. So if you have an overwhelming situation, you might faint. That's an old technique to avoid a traumatic situation. You might just feel numb, or you might freeze, or you might fall. But what the brain is doing, even in conscious states, is it's trying to soften that memory so it's more manageable for us to recollect it, so it doesn't feel so sharp. And the problem with that is that if I'm speaking to someone and say, well, let's talk about that story that happened to you 20, 30, 40 years ago, and I see them already starting to get reactive physically to the possibility of having to pull up that sharp rock again and deal with it, I have to be very careful that we do that as gently as possible, because you never quite know what you're unearthing when you're asking someone to tell you.
Well, I love that you said that because the mind cannot tell the difference between the past, the present, and the future. And for a lot of people, when you are working on these things and you're not working on it in a safe environment or with somebody who knows what they are doing, one can cause a lot of drama and trauma, and more so for a person because that person is reliving it in real time and the body is actually responding to it in real time. And I feel like that's one of the things that people don't understand about the heart, the mind, the spirit, is that there is no such thing as time. The past is now, the present is now, and the future is now. And so when they're working on this stuff, if they're not in good hands or they're not with somebody who really understands what they're doing, like yourself, I find that it can be more traumatic. I've actually been with therapists in my past that I feel I would walk out crying because I was like, what just happened to me? I feel like I regressed or I was being judged or I now stuck with a lot of this pain I don't know what to do with.
Well, when we remove an appendix, if someone comes to the hospital, we open them up, we remove the appendix, and we close them up. In a therapy session, there's something similar going on. We open them up, we address the inflamed area of their life, but do we close them up? And one of my rules in the therapy session is that it's not over till they're closed. Because if they're not closed, they're leaving, and they're who knows what can happen. And I've
That's
certainly
right.
had to learn how to look after that issue over the years. Because when I started out, I was not aware of some of those issues because it was some years ago. PTSD therapy wasn't even really being talked about. Let me make one important point, though, when we're talking about post-traumatic stress, is that post-traumatic stress in some way is a memory disorder. And that when an event happens to us, it's supposed to fade away over time and go into the back libraries of our memories. And to bring it back, we have to bring it back. A traumatic memory doesn't go backwards. It stays there. And so people get flashbacks and triggers and dreams and re-experiencing because they're living their life now through that trauma. And when they go into a therapy situation, we're trying to get that trauma to begin that process of moving into the past history so that it's no longer in the way of their life. It's part of their backstory, but it's no longer defining them. And I define a traumatic event as something that changes the definition of who you are.
Yeah.
And if something doesn't, and it's relatively trivial, okay, I'm who I am. But if something changes who you are and how you think and feel about yourself, that's probably a trauma event that needs to be dealt with very, very delicately.
Yes, 1,000%. I know for myself, I had the situation with the abandonment with my father and how that makes you feel unworthy, that you're never good enough, that there's always somebody else better than you. My father left my mother for another woman and her daughter. So there was a replacement of the two of us, not just my mother. And yes, it absolutely fractures how you see yourself, especially when you're young and you do not know what is happening to you, why it's really happening. And, I was born in 1979. So when my whole trauma went down, it was in the, it was in the good old 80s, where they weren't really open about all this stuff. Divorce at the time my parents had a divorce was still a taboo sort of thing. It's not like today. And so it was very hush hush. And I remember my mom taking us to a therapist as children, which I thought was very smart. Um, but still, you, you don't really know at that moment how this is going to play out until you start to get older.
Well, you raise a really powerful image for me. When a baby monkey is born, it can hold on to its mummy, can hold on. It has enough strength in its limbs, enough brain development to be able to hold on to its mother. And the mum can just kind of walk around and climb a tree while its baby is holding on to it. Human being babies can't do that. We have to be held. And that have to be held is metaphorical as well. We have to be held physically. We have to be held emotionally. So if you have early loss and you literally get dropped from the treetops as a child emotionally, your definition of what safety and attachments feels like has been completely interfered with because of that experience. And then going forward, if you don't know what a healthy attachment feels like, you might even think an unhealthy attachment is normal. And that's how it was for me. So I just had to learn to deal with it. My parents got divorced in 1980, also a time that wasn't that cool for parents to be divorced. And it just felt like a lot of shame happening to you. I was 20 at the time, so it wasn't I wasn't a child, of course. I wasn't very grown up, though, at the time, and I know it affected me really, really significantly. But can you imagine if I was much, much, much younger, as in your case? So that's why this being able to hold on to the parent versus expecting the parent to be able to hold on to you and to have that lost can be absolutely devastating.
You have hit it right on the head, especially with the safety part. Because I truly believe that the panic anxiety that came into my life after, right, didn't really rear its ugly head in full force until my father was back in my life. And the same concern was underneath, which was, is the shoe going to drop again? Can I trust this person? Am I safe with this person? And man, it was ramping up. And that combined with life, and to your point, you said you don't even know what a healthy relationship is. You don't. You continue to repeat patterns. Mine is always with narcissists. I can attract a narcissist like you would not believe. Man, you could stick me out and then there could be 50 people and they will be like, hey, all the nice people will scatter and the narcissists will be like, what? And I believe that's because that energy is home to me. I actually have a signal due to my past. Now, I've been working on this quite a bit, but I absolutely believe it. And Ashok, in my head, when I meet someone like this, the first thing that my head says is no. Don't be friends with this person, or back in the day, don't date this person. But there was an impulse, something that felt familiar about that person. And yeah, that's what I think is so hard sometimes when you're trying to navigate that past and you're trying to feel safe in the world, and yet you're picking people who fundamentally do not make you feel safe.
There's often things that there's two aspects to the I attract narcissists issue. One is they look big and shiny and confident. That's one thing. But the other thing, and I don't know you well enough to say this with any conviction, but I'm guessing this is right. You might be a hyper-empath. And if you're a hyper-empath, that means that your smoke signals are saying, you don't have empathy. I have enough empathy for both of us. I have in abundance what you lack. And to them, that's a very, very attractive feature. Because narcissists could not function if they didn't have empaths around them. They couldn't. Their tribe has to have empaths to do that thing for them to be able to navigate and help them get through. If they simply were narcissistic without an empath beside them, yeah, they're not going to make it very well. And the other issue, just to confuse it a bit more, is the issue of trust. There's two types of trust. There's absolute trust or unconditional trust and functional trust. Functional trust is the trust you do when you go to a foreign country, get in a cab and say, take me to the hotel. That's functional. Absolute trust is, I will give you everything I have and trust you with everything I have. We're supposed to start out with absolute trust as children. What happens if that gets smashed? Then you're just trying to turn functional trust into absolute trust. And so, as you said just earlier, you're waiting for that shoe to drop.
Yeah. And I'd love for you to expand on this, because I have a lot of people in my audience who identify as empaths. Okay. And what you just said about narcissists needing empaths, because I feel like an empathetic person doesn't always see this right away. They don't understand it. I hear it all the time. Angelique, why do I continue to attract people like this? Now, I understand it from a polarity spectrum, like attracts like and its opposite. So there is a lot of that has to do with polarity and duality and the nature of dark and light and the balance of those two things. But outside of that, right, if we move out of that esoteric sort of definition, how do you, when you're working with your clients, for example, how do you explain to a highly empathetic person that this is something that is kind of part of who they are too? Because I do think when they understand their participation in that connection, in that energy exchange, it becomes easier to identify it, to bring that awareness that they would need in order to protect themselves from those kinds of energies.
So that's a big question, but I'm going to start off with childhood again. So if a child has a significant loss, they often get parentified, which means they start to take on roles of parents. They start to be able to look after their siblings, look after their parents, look after themselves. That means that they need to become hyper-vigilant and to look at all the things in the environment that could go wrong and how they could fix it. They get really good at noticing what people's pain points are, how you can soothe them, how you can make them be less upset. I used to go around the house and put all the cups and saucers that were on tables before my dad came home, because I know if he saw one, he'd have a rage attack and the whole night was going to be lost. Or I'd be vacuuming. I'd come home from school and be vacuuming. I had other siblings, but they were not sensitive to that kind of stuff. I was. So this constant hypervigilance, this parentification, you wear that and you show that. That's an energy that you show. And narcissists are looking for that person who has that energy. What hyper-empaths or anyone that has more than they can handle empathy, they have to learn boundaries. And if you don't have boundaries around your empathy, you're going to have a sign that says to narcissists, here I am, I just don't have any protection. And boundaries are hard for empaths because it feels like you're being mean if you turn down your empathy. Like, I'm not going to be mean. I want to be kind and considerate and compassionate, so I'm not going to turn it down full on so I continue to be that person I've always been. But that, of course, is a recipe for problems.
1,000%. I always say this, a narcissist targets an empath's kindness, always, and they wait to weaponize that kindness against them. And that is a very tough thing for a lot of people to deal with, because they'll say to me, well, Angelique, I don't want to be the bad guy. Or, well, Angelique, I feel badly because, they just said, oh, you're not so nice. Fact is, that's just weaponizing kindness. Kindness is not synonymous with weakness. We know that. As a matter of fact, true kindness is synonymous with strength. And as you said, boundaries, knowing when to say no, knowing when to say this isn't acceptable to me. So in your practice, you work with a lot of people to help them with their empathetic nature. And how do you do that? How do you offer this service that you've now delved in and you understand this empathetic nature, being one yourself and having gone through your own story?
The essence of the beginning of that conversation has to start with self-care. So if you're on an airplane and the yellow mask comes down, you put it on yourself first. The narcissist is going to take it off your face and put it on themselves. So if you know that you have to look after yourself, you have to be able to optimize yourself. You have to be able to have enough air in your lungs, enough blood in your body, enough energy in your soul to be able to look after you. Then you're capable of looking after somebody else. And if people have a lot of empathy, that's great, but you have to have self-empathy, which is the same as getting in your car, looking at that dashboard and saying, oh, we don't have enough gas to get to where I want to go. Oh, my tires are a bit flat. Oh. So the first thing I have to do before I go putzing around and picking everybody up is I need to look after my car. Well, guess what? We're more important than a car, at least I hope. I need to look after me and make sure my dashboard is level and workable so I can go out and do those other things for other people. That's what I say.
That's very good advice. There are not that many people know how to do that. Self-care is tough, especially if you're a giver and you're constantly giving your energy away. Yes, self-care is going to be a tough one because, to your point, most people will suffer through in order for somebody else's happiness to be at the forefront of their experience. And that can be really tough if you're constantly giving and you're never getting anything back. That's a complete energy drain.
Well, I'm not female, but I think this is a bigger issue for women as well. I think women are much more programmed in so many ways to suffer for their children, suffer through their pregnancies, suffer through their deliveries, and I think it's difficult if you're a man trying to mansplain to a woman, oh, you can have boundaries with your self-care, because sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes it is not possible, and you have to give even if you don't have much for yourself. However, when you get out of that story of urgency and you're back to more stability with yourself, that's when you sit down, take some inventory and say, well, when's the last time I had a good sleep? When's the last time I had a good laugh? When's the last time I felt really relaxed and peaceful? When was the last time I took my pulse and it was a resting pulse, not a racing pulse from anxiety? Because what is anxiety? Its very essence, it's an alarm system to say there's danger. And if people have an alarm system to say there's danger and there's no danger, they're still going to feel the alarm. And that's still going to create wear and tear in their bodies, which is why people have panic attacks or anxiety. We have to teach that person to find that calm space in as many ways that they're available to do that. And there's a few techniques to do that, of course. But I think if I was to look at my practice, I see about half men, half women. Most of my narcissists are male, and most of my hyper-empaths are female.
Oh, that's interesting. Very, very interesting. I've seen both recently. So I'll tell you, recently I've come across more females, but in my past it was all male. So I agree with you 1,000%. I don't know why recently I've had a lot of run-ins with narcissistic females who have a predominance of masculine energy, which is super interesting, right? Because you are making a valid point about the male-female connection. But I would say that there is something that, and I know a lot of people think about this, is how can they be kind and still have that empathetic nature without getting bulldozed? And yeah, they're going to have to boundary and they're going to have to figure out what that is. Where does story come into this?
Well, I think story is a few things. One, it's a series of events that we can record. And then the minute we tell somebody else that story, it becomes interpretation. So, I was born in England in 1960. The feminist movement was just a few years away. The birth control pill had just been invented. And then when that happened, women could have much more control over their reproductive lives, and they could take on male roles. And since then, we've seen much more women, and this is to your point earlier, who are thinking that male role includes some of the behaviors that we're trying to eradicate from toxic masculinity in men. And so we're seeing men trying to get softer, but women thinking, especially after working in a male-dominated environment, they have to be tougher. And I think that's a terrible thing, that a woman has to prove herself that she's just as good as a man. There's no question that females are the dominant half of our species. There's no question in my mind. They don't have to prove it. But I think the story that we're all living is, what is our role? What is our role with each other? And when we engage in that role empathically and generously and with compassion, I think the story becomes much easier to tell each other, especially expectations of how we're supposed to treat each other.
And that's a big one right now, expectations of how we're supposed to treat each other. Because if we take a look around the world, people are not treating each other very kindly. People are not treating each other very compassionately or empathetically, which does play in to a high level of intelligence. And I do feel that sometimes, arrogance and ignorance are brothers. And when you have people that are constantly arrogant, ignorant, they're not connected to that kind of heart center, nor are they connected to the idea that humanity is a race and that we are all together in this fight. It becomes a lot more difficult for people to find that connection, right? And to understand that we both, men and women, carry both feminine and masculine energy. That's just,
of course.
yeah, that's just the way it is. And I sometimes get men that are like, "Oh no, I'm not feminine." It's like, again, woo, are you missing the point, sir? But the bigger point is, we're all more alike, and we have more commonalities than we do differences. And I feel that as we start to find our humanity and find those pieces of, well, we may not have the same story, but I could find compassion for your story. I can now, as an empath, I can feel it. But for those that aren't necessarily empathetic in that way, compassion is just that, okay, I understand. And I feel for you. I understand that human plight that you've been in. I feel like we have gone so far away from having that compassionate nature toward one another.
Well, just to make a general comment about emotions, some emotions we only have in our lifetime and we have it for ourselves, like love. Some emotions actually get passed down the generations. So the great-great-great-grandchildren can have very similar emotions. So revenge is one of those ones that can get passed down. So you can have a grandson seeking to extract revenge for his grandfather. And shame also has the same effect. Shame can pass down generations, so that you can have great-great-great-grandchildren who still feel ashamed of something that their forefathers had done. And I think that when we realize that, we realize that we might not be fighting for our story. We might be fighting for stories that precede us for centuries. And then what is our story? And it's up to us to change the story. When I was in school, corporal punishment was legal. Teachers could whip and cane students. And if we can get corporal punishment out of the schools, we can get bullying, we can get toxic abuse, we can get that out of culture as well if we work together as a community.
Yes, community is key, and that's what's important. And that's where leadership comes into play. And right now, at least our leadership is under the influence of anger, violence, and separation, division, etc. So I feel like it's harder for people to eradicate those ancestral patterns that we're talking about, because they're being triggered constantly. Over and over and over again, people are getting triggered. And that trigger, because if you've done the work, right, then you understand the trigger. If you haven't done the work, you are operating kind of on automatic, and you may feel that this is just how it is, right? I see something, it upsets me, I respond. One of the things I like to say to people is to call cut on the idea that you need to respond. Take a breath. Wait a minute. Look around, assess the situation before you respond to things that are going on around you, especially, and I hate to use social media, but social media is one hell of a battleground. Certain platforms, LinkedIn is a little less so, but there are some social media sites where they are brutal, absolutely brutal. And everything that we do, whether spoken or written, writes the story of our humanity. It puts it into the consciousness. So people say to me, well, what does it matter if I blew up? It does matter. It absolutely does matter, because it keeps us stuck in a lower vibrational energy that we can't necessarily hit up to a higher frequency. And that's where then more people, I'm mean to you, and then you get upset because I was mean to you, and then your kid's like, oh, hey, and then you snap at your child, and it goes and it goes and it goes. It's a ripple effect, but it's also a ripple effect on the positive end. So you're absolutely right. If we can get the communities all on the same page, telling the same story, then we have a chance to elevate consciousness through compassion and empathy, which is really the pathway to doing that.
So I know that when my amazing daughter was in high school and Facebook was just coming out in those days, and she said she's got all these friends on Facebook. I said, oh, I see you've got this guy's the friend. Isn't he a couple of grades behind you in school? Yeah. Would you sit with him in the cafeteria? Oh, no. But I will join him on Facebook. And so one of the issues with social media is two-dimensional. Human beings are designed for three-dimensional interaction, to be in each other's three-dimensional space with each other, so you can feel, sense, reflect three-dimensionally. When we remove that and just have two dimensions, it makes it a lot easier to be judgmental or to be glib or just to make a presumption about someone, because you're not actually in that space with them and you're not feeling their energy in the same way. And one of my worries, as a human being on the planet, is two-dimensionality can begin to thin out the capacity to feel the essence of our connection with each other. So if empathy is appreciating someone's perspective, compassion is formulating something you can do if they have a pain point to help them, and kindness is the execution of the action of that compassion, but we're not feeling that, then we're going to thin out compassion and kindness as well. So I'm a huge proponent. I think social media for me has been interesting, but I'm old, right? I had all those years of three-dimensional experiences for decades before I jumped into social media. Said, oh, look at this. I can have thousands of people kind of hanging off my words. I don't, but that's a bit of an ego trip for some of us. My goal, just to talk about social media, is it's an opportunity to help people find their tools that can help them be more empathic with each other. Because I think empathy is completely teachable. I don't think it's something that you have and that you just have it. I have had quite a few people with narcissistic personality disorder in therapy, and about 20% of them get better. Most of them don't, but about 20. And I had one guy come in once and said he was mad at me. I said, why? He said, because now I have all these feelings. Now I really care about people. I passed the guy in the street and I gave him $20, and you're costing me money, doctor. I said, well, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Well, in the bank of the soul, you're enriching him. So you're doing him a huge favor.
Exactly my point. Thank you for putting it that way.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a very good point about social. We're connected, but we lack connection. And that is there is a difference between the two. And
yeah.
When you can look into the eyes of a human being, not a picture or a video, it's a whole other experience. Because when they say you can see the soul of a person through their eyes, you absolutely can. That's if you're quiet enough and you're really being an active listener. You're not thinking about what you're going to say or making snap judgments or allowing the monkey mind to keep going. You're really connecting to somebody. That's what we're missing. So your point about the two-dimensionality versus the three is very, very insightful. I think that will help people to understand what they're dealing with. You're looking at people as though they're NPCs in a lot of ways, right? Non-player characters, because you're not engaging with that person in a personal way. You're engaging with them in a public, almost like a public arena. A public persona is being created. And at that public persona, people are throwing their judgments based on a little bit of information that is being given. Because it's only a little bit of information that you're getting about a human being at any point in time. One conversation will tell you a lot more than 50 posts that you're going to see on social media.
I think this is not only true, this is This is something that we need to spend way more time teaching our kids. And we raise our kids, just as social media, the internet, and all that was beginning to come in. And my kids have grandchildren, and they're trying to keep their phones and their tabs away from their children, because they know the minute the child is engaging with the tablet or the cell phone, that's way more interesting to them than having a conversation or being read a book. And I think our brains develop at a rate that nature designed it to develop at. And if we rush that, and we talked about this at the very beginning of our meeting around losing a parent at a very early age and how that changes your perception of attachment. What about your perception of how we learn things? And if we only learn things at a very fast, multiple screen flashing kind of rate, then we're going to want that in everywhere. We want to kind of have a change of scenery, a change of, in other words, distractibility, much more. And so our capacity to focus on one thing that may not be extremely exciting and engaging is becoming increasingly difficult, because you can just change the channel. And when you sit with a human being for an hour, who does that anymore? For an hour, you're going to sit with one person. You can't change the channel. You can't be looking around the room. You can't be fidgeting too much, because you're sending signals to that person that you're disengaging. Because human beings are designed through nonverbal ways to sense each other's engagement with each other constantly. And if you and I are directing the scene and we had no words, we just had movement, and we wanted one character to show the other character disinterest, the hands would be folded, they'd be looking away, they would be pointed at the exit of the room, all that kind of stuff, because we're highly programmed to recognize all those signs. And social media is a way to connect to someone who's actually disconnected from you, and that's pregnant.
So I love that you brought this up about directing, because, life is very similar to a movie, as that it is a stage, right? And we are the writer, directors, and stars of our show. But as a director, I can't tell you how many times when I've had to be on stage with actors that I would say, all right, cut the dialogue. We're going to just do this sort of mise-en-scene, and I want you to react to each other without words. And it changes. And the reason it changes is because of perception. A lot of people are way too self-aware of how they want to be seen in the world, not how they are seen in the world, right? How they want to be seen. Interestingly enough, so my husband, he wrote a story about his personal life. And when I first met him, he was doing this on stage, okay? And he was very good at it. He played himself. When we got to the point where we were going to do a larger run of this and then the movie, I said to him, I think it's time to let an actor play you. And he's like, well, who's going to play me better than me, right? Which is it's a fair question. And I said, everyone. Because you have the shame, the guilt. You have a way you want to be seen in the world. But an actor will play you based on the story that's being told about you, and they will allow the audience to see all facets of your personality. And that's the thing that I feel when we start to tell our stories is things like social media, past, shame, all of these standards, these societal standards that we can't possibly keep up with, force people to create these public personas. And the public personas are in contradiction often with who the person really is. There's so many times I'll see somebody on social media, and then when I meet them in life, I'm like, oh, wow, okay, not what I was expecting. They're very different, and sometimes for the better, and sometimes not always for the better. For our children, it's hard because kids see all this, to your point, all this stuff, the bright and shiny objects, 24-hour pageant of whatever they want. They lack the ability to discern what is real and what is not. And I feel like that is one of the more harmful things, because they are comparing themselves 90% of the time to fantasy.
Well, that's a very important point to make, in that children naturally have magical thinking, which means that they can believe in magic. They think that this is me doing something with my fingers. It's not. I'm okay. Santa Claus is amazing. Yes. Does Santa Claus really come down the chimney? So magical thinking magical thinking can be held really indefinitely in our lives. And if you look at obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, for example, it's a disorder of magical thinking when someone thinks magically, irrespective of them now being an adult and realizing that, yes, I know Santa Claus doesn't literally come down the chimney, but so the power of magical thinking is to be able to believe in things that don't exist or it couldn't possibly happen. And if you confuse probability with possibility, that means that anything's possible. So yeah, you could step on a crack and hurt your mom's back. And I think as we move forward and realize that logic itself isn't enough. Now, if I say to a client, "Oh, just be logical," that couldn't happen. That doesn't help. I have to go back to where they had that magical thinking as a child and seeing what happened to them, that they encased that and they've kept it going forward in their life into adulthood. And it's usually always a trauma of some kind.
Yes. And, I love that you bring up magical thinking and imagination, because that is the thing I feel is under attack by this whole AI cyber sort of reality that we're moving into. When everything is sort of laid out and we don't go into magical lands, or we read something that then our imagination takes us into this place where, Ashok has his version of it, Angelique has her version of it, versus we're watching it and we're getting one perspective of it, right? But our imagination isn't being triggered in that way. We're seeing that story play out. The beauty in kids playing make-believe, and, I make my son do this. I'll say, get off that thing and go outside and play. Go talk to the trees. And he'll be like, talk to the trees. Yeah, talk to the trees. Go. There's magical realms all around, and you can tap into it, but you're not tapping into it because you're stuck on this machine. And I'm not going to say that I don't think that there is a benefit to the cyber if it is properly balanced with nature, but it's got to have the balance, because imagination is what makes us creators. And if we talk about what we both are interested in is the story, if you lack the ability to rewrite the story because you're not sure how a story even plays out, then you get stuck and you always feel stuck.
I agree with that. I think, if I lift weights, and so if I'm lifting weights, I can't do that online. I actually have to have a weight in my hand of a certain amount and lift it in order to get a workout. And I fear the same thing's happening with our imagination. If we're not lifting that muscle and building that muscle of imagination, what's going to happen in 20 years if someone says, ChatGPT or whatever it is, write me a story about this, and it does it in 30 seconds. We're not using our mind to do that. If something becomes useless, it withers away. If you don't use this muscle, it withers away. If we don't use this muscle in our mind, I worry about that all the time. And I remember as kids, we played with boxes. If we didn't have a toy, we turned something into the toy and used our imagination to imagine what it was. It was a spaceship, it was a truck, whatever. And if kids are losing that capacity, or we're not providing that capacity often enough to them, with those other ingredients as well alongside of it, then what's going to happen with their mind development if they've only ever lifted a weight online?
That's beautifully said. And also, when we think about reality is created from imagination, that we are co-creators. This is a lot more dangerous than people realize, because this isn't just, AI versus, humanity. This is the absolute dumbing down of humanity to a point where we cannot create a reality outside of what is being given to us. And the stories that we're being told, whether it be through media, whether it be, through our leaders, wherever these stories are coming, we will not be able to have that critical thinking, using our minds to say, wait a minute, this isn't right. Using our minds to imagine something better so that we can start to rewrite those stories. So you're right. It is not a good thing that imagination is being hijacked and dumbed down.
Not a good thing. The purpose of education is twofold. One, to learn, and then to learn information and to learn how to think critically. And if one of those is taken away and we're just consuming information, but we're not learning how to critically look at it because we believe that that's been done for us, then that part of our brain that looks at information and says, wait a minute, something doesn't quite add up. Or empathically, I don't feel this adds up. Because a lot of time, if someone's telling me a story, especially in a clinical setting, I'm not just listening to the facts of the story, I'm feeling the emotions of the story. And if they're telling me a story and I notice a tear trickling down the side of their eye and they're not telling me sadness, we're going to put the brakes on that for a second. I said, I noticed that your body's responding. What's that emotion that you're feeling? We click into that emotion, and that opens up a brand new part of that story that maybe they've locked away from themselves. And that requires me to imagine where they're at. I have to use my imagination empathically to see where they're at.
Yes. And that's going back to a true connection. That is how we humans connect. You know, the Heart Math Institute talks about how the heart has the heart coherence, which is actually 3 feet out in front of us, right? So when you and I walk into a room, our hearts speak before we ever talk physically, which I think is just so cool when you think about it, because it means that we are way more sentient than people think we are. Our energy centers are way more important. A lot of the times, and you know about the chakras, and these our energy centers are stifled, they're reversed. We're not in our full potential. We're not attached to our imagination. We don't understand how our energy and our connection with others is actually how we rise, how we elevate, how we get out of these old stories, these limiting stories that have taken us down. And I think that it's really important especially for kids, because they are the future. They are the ones that are going to lead us to this next level of consciousness, hopefully. And we need to protect their imagination. I make my child, and I'm going to do it shortly too. I'm like, let's go. Come on. And he's like, oh, I want to play Fortnite. And it's like, great. We all want to do certain things, but today you're going to tell me a story. Today we're going to go for a walk. We're going to be present. And that is a hard thing these days. You sit at a dinner with people nowadays, you're lucky if they will look you straight in the eye. Yeah, and they're not like, oh, I just have to answer this text or this email. And you're like, but you're here with me right now. So whoever you're texting or emailing, unless it's an emergency, should wait.
Yeah, I mean, just to ever so briefly touch on this, I think one of the reasons why we have sort of phones that are kind of everywhere with us is that people are essentially alone. We're born alone and we die alone. And the idea that we're alone is a dreadful thing to think. And having a phone means you're not alone. So someone can go out alone and pull out their phone, and they're not alone anymore. They have the essence of it. In the old days, it used to be TV, but now we have the phone. So what does that mean? If the phone takes the place of being alone, that means that we're not going to reach out to someone next to us if we're on a plane flying somewhere long distance and say, hey, this is me, who are you, and have a conversation that could end up in being an important connection in life. Or in the dating world, if people stop saying, hey, what's your story? This is mine. And instead people are on their phone, we're actually negating the possibility to pay attention to that 3 feet of energy that we all have, to say, I'm feeling a connection. I don't know what it is, but can we investigate that? If you're not interested, that's fine. But if you are, let's look at what that connection is. And then when you're telling someone a story, and one of my lines is always that empathy is stories are packages of empathy. When you're telling someone a story, you're unpacking some of your empathy for them. And they're unpacking some of the empathy for you. And that's connecting.
See, I love this. I could talk to you about this stuff all day. This is one of those things that I feel this is a conversation that should be ongoing. And it is a conversation that you continuously have. So tell the audience a little bit more about how they can get in contact with you, a little bit about your practice, your book.
Yeah, well, I've written a couple of books. The first one I wrote is called Cake, and it's called A Guide to Reciprocal Empathy for Couples. And it's my effort to deal with some of the divorce rates in my town that's about 60%. I also work in the burnout sector, so I wrote a book called Deep Fried Nerves. It's essentially a novel about the burning out of a psychiatrist. It's not me, folks, okay? But everyone thinks it is, but it's not. I'm on LinkedIn every day. I post a lot and I comment a lot. I belong to a DEI group in San Francisco called Inclusive Leadership. And we'd love to have people show up to that. We have lots of very, very important conversations about connection. And I do have a website called theempathyclinic.com. And there aren't that many Ashok Bhattacharyas on the internet. So once people get the spelling right, I'm pretty easy to find.
Yes, you are easy to find, and you are always delightful to engage with on social media, friends. Ashok is very kind. He will come. He is very supportive. I am so happy that you came on the show. It was such a wonderful conversation. And I always feel with you that you have a lot of very interesting and insightful points. As this conversation is going on, I'm thinking, yep. And I hope that people really heard a lot of what you said, because there's so much in there about the future and how really compassion and empathy are at the forefront if we would love to elevate our consciousness and to really help heal humanity as a whole.
Well, I love that you said that, but I also think that I don't have the answers. I think people have the answers inside of them. And my job is to give people the inspiration to explore that and to explore that with the people around them, because that's how we build community. We build community by empathizing with each other. And if at the very beginning, we realized that we had to be with each other to survive at the very beginning. And that hasn't changed. We still have that as a species. And we can do that metaphorically in so many different ways now. I never would have met you if it wasn't the internet. So thank God for the internet. But,
Yeah.
There's a whole lot more with those three-dimensional connections. And thank you so much, by the way, for having me on the show. It's been a delight talking to you.
Yes, of course. And friends, please follow, connect with Ashok. He's amazing. And thank you so much again for being on the show. And we'll hopefully have you back to talk more about empathy, compassion, and lighting the way home.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me on Call Cut with Angelique. New episodes drop every Friday. If you like this content, please subscribe, like, share with your friends. And remember, folks, no matter what life gives you, you must always keep shining.